On 30th of January 1649, King Charles I of England awoke, knowing he would not see the sun go down. As he'd been given the choice, he had elected 2 p.m. to be the time of his own execution. Every year, on the last Sunday of January, people gather in London to remember what they call the horrid murder of their king. But what happened on that fateful day? And how did Charles I, once the anointed ruler of 3 kingdoms, meet such a tragic end? Dawn broke cold and grey over London. Charles spent his final hours in St. James's Palace, deep in prayer. Outside, soldiers and onlookers gathered. The atmosphere was tense. Few could believe a king was about to be executed, an act unprecedented in English history. It was time to leave. Soldiers holding pikes aloft escorted him to his own royal palace of Whitehall. Before entering, he saw the temporary scaffold draped in black cloth erected outside the banqueting house. By now, Charles had accepted his fate and determined to face his execution with dignity. He wore 2 shirts to prevent him from shivering in the January cold, which he knew people might mistake for fear. He ate his last meal of bread and wine so he wouldn't feel faint. At 2 o'clock he entered the banqueting house and walked beneath the Reuben ceiling that glorified the royal Stuart dynasty. He stepped out onto the scaffold. But what on earth had led to this shocking event? Charles's problems started long before his execution. He constantly clashed with Parliament over money, religion, and power. At one point, he even shut them down and ruled alone for 11 years. He was his own worst enemy. He was principled to a fault, unyielding, secretive, and arrogant. He believed in the divine right of kings, that his authority came directly from God, and he was only prepared to answer to God. He ignored his faithful advisers, and he ignored public opinion. By 1642, tensions erupted into civil war. On one side stood the royalists, loyal to the king. On the other, parliamentarians, led by Oliver Cromwell. After years of bloody conflict, the parliamentarians emerged victorious. Charles was captured and tried for treason. He was found guilty of being a tyrant, a traitor, a murderer, and a public enemy. On the scaffold, soldiers were waiting for him, and there, by the block, stood the executioner and his assistant. They were disguised in sailors' costumes, with wigs, fishnet masks, and false beards, all to ensure their anonymity. Charles gave his last speech declaring his innocence. He said he would die as a martyr of the people. But his people, the crowd, were held so far back they couldn't hear what he was saying. He turned towards the block. It was just a rough piece of tree trunk, and he examined it. There were ropes and chains in case he struggled. He suddenly became anxious. He had heard how, just over 50 years previously, the axeman with blunt tools had to hack and saw away at the sinews of the neck of his grandmother, Mary, Queen of Scots. Charles demanded of the executioner, "Are you expert enough?" "I am, sir." "Is the axe sharp enough?" "It is, sir." "Does my hair trouble you?" When the axeman said, "Yes, sir, it does," Charles made sure his long hair was properly tucked into his nightcap. Then the king knelt before the block. The executioner performed his task with one clean swipe. There was a loud, unearthly groan from the crowd. Then he picked up the king's head and held it aloft. The job was done. While many in the crowd wept and wailed, the soldiers on the scaffold were jubilant, clapping their hands and dipping their swords into his blood. They hacked off bloody chips from the wooden scaffold and locks of Charles's hair, hoping to sell them later. The king's corpse was then taken off to be embalmed, and the head sewn back on. The surgeon described this task as like stitching the head back onto a goose. Long queues of people then formed, each holding out a halfpenny as a fee to view the dead king's body. England became a republic under Cromwell, but the monarchy was eventually restored in 1660, when the late king's son was crowned as King Charles II at Westminster Abbey. In that year, Charles I was to be canonised as a martyr by the Church of England, a legacy honoured to this day. In London, his memory lives on. Each year, reenactors of the Civil War Society gather to honour the man they see as a symbol of loyalty and sacrifice. Charles I's story is one of belief, stubbornness and tragedy. His execution is a warning about the dangers of absolute power. The struggle between authority and freedom continues to this day. I do hope you've enjoyed my film. If you'd like to see more films about historical personalities in London, please give the film a like and subscribe to my channel, Hello London Life. Thank you so much.